The massive doors of the Galactic Council chamber slid open with a deep rumbling sound that echoed through the vast hall. Captain Jake Morrison stepped inside, his black military uniform looking plain next to the bright colors and strange shapes of the alien delegates around him. Behind him walked Dr. Lisa Grant, carrying a small datapad that held Earth's proposal for dealing with the growing threat that had every species in the galaxy worried. The chamber was huge, with seats arranged in circles that went up toward the ceiling like a giant bowl. Each seat was designed for a different type of alien body. Some floated in bubbles of green gas, others sat on crystalline structures that hummed with energy, and a few hung upside down from the ceiling on metal cables. In the center of it all sat High Counselor Vex, an insect-like being the size of a small car, his black eyes reflecting the light from hundreds of screens showing star maps. Jake had been to the council 3 times before, but he still felt small in this place. Earth had only been a member for 5 years, and most of the other species treated humans like children who had just learned to walk. The oldest members had been traveling between stars for thousands of years before humans even invented the wheel. The council recognizes the delegation from Earth, High Counselor Vex announced, his voice coming through a translator that made it sound flat and emotionless. A few of the alien delegates made sounds that Jake guessed were either laughing or coughing. It was hard to tell the difference sometimes. Dr. Grant stepped forward to the speaking platform in the center of the chamber. The holographic display activated, showing images of the destroyed star systems on the outer edge of the galaxy. Entire planets had been stripped down to nothing but rock and metal. Space stations that had existed for centuries were gone without a trace. "Honored counselors," Lisa began, her voice steady despite the hundreds of alien eyes watching her. "We have studied the attack patterns of what you call the Void Swarm. Based on our analysis, we believe conventional military tactics will not be effective against this enemy." A sound like breaking glass came from the section where the crystal being sat. Ambassador Zektor rose from his seat, his transparent body glowing brighter as he became agitated. "The primitives think they understand warfare better than races who have fought among the stars for millennia?" More sounds filled the chamber. Jake recognized some of them as laughter, though it came in forms he had never heard before. Clicking, buzzing, and musical tones that somehow all meant the same thing. The aliens thought this was funny. Lisa continued despite the noise. "Human military history shows that unconventional tactics can defeat superior forces. We propose using small, fast attacks combined with psychological warfare to disrupt their coordination." The laughter got louder. A being that looked like a walking tree with too many arms waved them in what Jake assumed was their version of dismissive gesture. "Psychological warfare? Against a hive mind that consumes planets? What will you do? Hurt their feelings?" "Hi." Counselor Vex clicked his mandibles together, which Jake had learned meant he was thinking. "The Void Swarm has destroyed fleets containing millions of ships. They adapt to every weapon we use against them. They learn from every battle. What makes you think your emotional approach would succeed where logic and superior technology have failed?" Jake stepped forward, unable to stay quiet any longer. "Because we have something they have never faced before. Every battle you have fought against them has been about protecting your own people, your own worlds. You calculate acceptable losses and retreat when the math does not work in your favor." "Of course," said a floating creature that looked like a jellyfish made of metal. "That is basic military strategy. You preserve forces for future battles rather than waste them in hopeless situations." "That is exactly the problem," Jake replied, his voice getting louder. "Humans do not retreat when protecting others. We do not calculate acceptable losses when innocent lives are at stake. We fight harder when we are losing, not weaker. We sacrifice ourselves for strangers, even for people who hate us." The chamber fell quiet for a moment. Then Ambassador Zektor began to glow even brighter, his crystalline form pulsing with what Jake recognized as anger. "Illogical. Wasteful. This is precisely why your species should not be involved in strategic planning. You allow emotions to override sensible decision-making." High Counselor Vex raised one of his front legs, calling for order. The human approach is noted, but the Council has already decided on our strategy. The combined fleets of the core worlds will meet the Void Swarm at the Kepler defense line. We will use coordinated attacks with our most advanced weapons. And when that fails? Lisa asked quietly. It will not fail, Vex replied with certainty. We have the most powerful fleet ever assembled. Every major species has contributed their best ships and most experienced commanders. The Void Swarm may have defeated scattered colonies and isolated systems, but they have never faced the full might of galactic civilization. Jake looked around the chamber at the confident faces of the alien delegates. They had no doubt they would win through superior numbers and technology. They had never lost a war by being too logical, too careful, too willing to preserve their forces for another day. What role will Earth play in this great battle? Lisa asked, though Jake could tell from her tone that she already knew the answer. Support, functions, Vex answered without hesitation. Supply runs, refugee evacuation, medical assistance, important work, but the actual fighting will be handled by species with more experience in large-scale warfare. Ambassador Zektor added, Perhaps Earth can contribute some of your emotional support techniques to help the refugees. Your species seems particularly good at making others feel better about hopeless situations. The laughter started again, echoing through the chamber like a wave. Jake felt his hands clench into fists, but he forced himself to stay calm. Getting angry would only prove their point about humans being too emotional for serious military work. The vote is called. High Counselor, Vex announced. All in favor of excluding Earth from strategic command and limiting their role to support functions? Lights began appearing throughout the chamber as delegates voted. Green lights meant yes, red lights meant no. Jake watched as green light after green light appeared. When the counting was finished, the result displayed on the main screen, 98.7%, in favor of excluding Earth. As the council session ended and delegates began filing out of the chamber, Jake and Lisa walked toward the exit in silence. Behind them, they could hear aliens discussing their battle plans, confident in their approaching victory. They will regret this, Jake said quietly as they reached the doors. Lisa nodded, clutching her datapad tighter. Yes, they will. But first, a lot of good people are going to die because they were too proud to listen. Outside the chamber, communication devices throughout the galaxy were already spreading the news. The Great Fleet was assembling. The most powerful force ever created was preparing for battle, and Earth had been assigned to carry supplies and comfort the survivors. None of them knew that in 3 weeks, there would not be any survivors to comfort. The hidden base on Europa looked like any other ice mining station from the outside. Giant machines carved through the frozen surface while workers in heavy suits moved containers of processed materials to waiting transport ships. But 50 meters below the ice, in chambers that did not appear on any official records, General Kate Sullivan stood before a wall of screens showing the real purpose of this facility. How many ships do we have ready? She asked Commander Rick Hayes, who was studying a holographic display of the outer solar system. 47 Ghost Fleet vessels are operational, Rick replied, his fingers dancing across the control panel to bring up detailed specifications. Another 23 will be ready within the week. The new stealth coating is working better than we hoped. During the last test, a hegemony patrol ship passed within 2 kilometers and never detected us. Kate nodded, satisfied with the progress. For 5 years, while the Galactic Council treated Earth like a junior partner, humanity had been preparing for the war that everyone else refused to see coming. The first Void Swarm scouts had appeared in human space 3 years before any other species encountered them. Earth's deep space monitoring stations had tracked their movements, studied their behavior, and reached a terrifying conclusion. Conventional warfare would not stop them. What about the new weapons? Kate asked, turning to Dr. Mike Chen, who was examining data from the latest test results. Mike looked up from his tablet, his face showing both excitement and worry. The Fury bombs are ready for deployment. We have tested them on captured swarm biomatter, and the results are remarkable. When exposed to concentrated human emotional broadcasts, their coordination breaks down completely. They start attacking each other instead of working together. And you are certain this will work on the main swarm? Kate pressed. As certain as we can be without fighting them directly, Mike replied. The swarm operates like a single mind controlling millions of bodies. But that mind was never designed to deal with the kind of emotional chaos that humans can produce. Fear, rage, love, sacrifice, these concepts disrupt their thought patterns. Lieutenant Amy Foster entered the command center, still wearing her flight suit from the latest training mission. Her squadron had been practicing maneuvers that would have been considered suicide by any other species in the galaxy, flying directly at enemy formations, ramming damaged ships into larger targets, and coordinating attacks where survival was not expected. How did the volunteers perform today? Kate asked Amy. Better than expected, Amy replied, pulling up the training results on her personal display. The Kepler refugees who joined us last month are learning fast. Turns out, once you show other species that it is possible to fight without calculating the odds of survival, they adapt quickly. Kate smiled grimly. The volunteers were aliens whose worlds had already been attacked by Void Swarm scouts. They had seen their governments make logical decisions about acceptable losses, watched their military forces retreat when the mathematics of battle turned against them, and lost everything they cared about as a result. When Earth secretly offered them a chance to fight back using human tactics, thousands had joined. The Council still thinks we are just running supply missions, Rick observed, checking the latest official communications. Yesterday they thanked us for delivering medical supplies to the refugee camps. They have no idea we have been training mixed-species combat units for 2 years. Good, Kate replied. Let them focus on their big battle plans. We will be ready when their strategy fails. The main screen changed to show the current position of the Galactic Council's assembled fleet. Over 15 million ships from hundreds of different species had gathered at the Kepler defense line. It was the largest military force in recorded galactic history, commanded by the most experienced admirals from dozens of ancient civilizations. They are so confident, Amy said, watching the fleet formations on the display. Look at how perfectly organized everything is. Each species has its assigned position, optimal firing patterns calculated down to the microsecond, retreat routes planned for minimum losses. That is exactly why they will lose, Mike added, pulling up his analysis of swarm battle tactics. Every fight the swarm has won followed the same pattern. They let the enemy attack first, analyze the strategy, adapt their defenses, then counterattack. With perfect efficiency, they are designed to defeat rational opponents who fight in predictable ways. Kate studied the tactical displays, comparing the Council's battle plan with humanity's alternative strategy. The difference was like night and day. The Council planned to engage the swarm in organized formations, using superior firepower and coordinated attacks. Earth's plan looked like organized chaos, small groups attacking from random directions, ships sacrificing themselves to save others, and tactics that made no mathematical sense. General, Rick said, pointing to an incoming priority message. We are getting reports from our deep space scouts. The swarm has started moving toward the Kepler line. They will reach the defense position in 72 hours. Kate felt her stomach tighten. This was the moment they had been preparing for, but she knew what it meant. In 3 days, the largest fleet in galactic history would face an enemy that had never been defeated. Most of those ships would not survive. Send the coded message to all Ghost Fleet commanders, she ordered. Operation Last Stand is now active. All units are to move to their assigned positions but remain hidden until the main battle begins. Amy checked her personal communicator and saw messages from her squadron leaders around the galaxy. The volunteers are ready, General. We have units positioned near every major population center that the swarm might target. If the main fleet fails, we can begin evacuations immediately. When the main fleet fails, Kate corrected gently. There is no if about this, Amy. The Council is about to learn that being logical and organized is not enough when your enemy can think faster than you can. Dr. Chen brought up the final piece of their secret preparation. The emotional broadcast network is online. We have hidden transmitters on over 300 worlds, all linked to our central command here on Europa. When we activate the Fury bombs, every human in the galaxy will be able to contribute their emotions to the signal. Kate, looked around at her team. These humans who had spent years preparing for a war that everyone else thought would be won easily. They knew the truth that the Great Galactic Council refused to accept. Sometimes the only way to win was to be willing to lose everything. "One more thing," she said, bringing up the final display. "I want everyone to understand what we are really fighting for. This is not about proving humans are better warriors than other species. This is about showing the galaxy that some things are worth dying for, even when dying does not make logical sense." The screen showed refugee camps throughout Council space, filled with survivors from the worlds the swarm had already consumed. Millions of beings who had lost their homes, their families, their entire civilizations because their governments had made reasonable decisions about acceptable casualties. "In 72 hours, the Council will face the swarm," Kate announced to her assembled commanders. "They will fight bravely and logically, and they will lose. When that happens, we will show them what it means to fight like humans." Outside, Europa's hidden base, the ice continued its ancient dance around Jupiter, looking peaceful and unchanged. But deep beneath the surface, humanity prepared for the moment when logic would fail, and only madness would have a chance to succeed. The emergency signal reached Earth at 03:47 hours, screaming across the galaxy faster than any ship could travel. Admiral Steve Parker was already awake in his command center, watching the long-range scanners that showed the destruction happening. At the Kepler defense line, the largest fleet in galactic history was being torn apart like paper in a hurricane. "Sir, we are receiving desperate transmissions from Council Command," reported Lieutenant Tom Davis, his voice shaking as he listened to the incoming messages. "They are requesting immediate assistance from all available forces. The Void Swarm is not just defeating their fleet, it is learning from every ship it destroys." Steve studied the tactical display showing the battle 300 light-years away. Red dots representing Council ships were disappearing by the thousands, while the blue mass of the Void Swarm grew larger with each passing minute. The aliens had fought exactly as predicted. Organized formations, coordinated attacks, logical retreat patterns when losses became too heavy. The swarm had analyzed every move, adapted to every weapon, and turned the Council's own tactics against them. "How long did the main battle last?" Steve asked, though he already knew the answer would be terrible. 4 hours and 17 minutes, Tom replied, checking the timestamp on the final transmission from the Council flagship. 15 million. Ships reduced to scattered refugee groups in less than 5 hours. The swarm is now moving toward the core worlds. Dr. Sarah Kim entered the command center carrying her research files on the Void Swarm's biological structure. For months, she had been studying samples recovered from early scout encounters, trying to understand what they were really fighting. Her discoveries had changed everything about Earth strategy. "Admiral, I have confirmed the analysis," Sarah announced, her voice filled with both excitement and horror. "The Void Swarm is not a natural species. They are weapons created by an ancient civilization that fell over 50,000 years ago. The builders designed them to defeat any logical military force." Steve turned from the tactical display to face the xenobiologist. "Tell me something I can use, Doctor." Sarah activated her holographic projector, showing the internal structure of a swarm entity. The original creators were like the current Council, rational, calculating, always making logical decisions about warfare. They built the swarm to be the perfect counter to that kind of thinking. Every time an enemy uses logical tactics, the swarm gets stronger. "But there is a weakness," Steve prompted, seeing the hope in Sarah's eyes. "Yes. The swarm cannot adapt to completely irrational behavior. Their programming breaks down when they encounter actions that make no logical sense. That is why human tactics work against them. We do things that their creators never imagined any intelligent species would do." Across the galaxy, Sergeant Tony Martinez was already putting that theory to the test. His unit had landed on Kolar Prime just as the Void Swarm arrived, intending to evacuate the civilian population. But when they saw millions of alien families, trapped in the capital city with no way to escape, Tony made a decision that horrified his alien allies. "We are going back," he announced to his mixed-species team as they watched swarm forces surrounding the city. "Sergeant, that is suicide," protested Zala, a reptilian warrior whose own people had declared Kolar Prime a total loss. The logical action is to save who we can and preserve our forces for the next battle. Tony checked his weapon and started walking toward the city. Then it is a good thing humans are not logical. His team followed him, even though every tactical manual in the galaxy said they should retreat. They fought through swarm forces using techniques that made no mathematical sense. Soldiers who threw themselves on enemy weapons to save civilians they had never met. Medics who stayed behind to treat wounded aliens while their escape routes were cut off, and tactical decisions based on saving lives rather than preserving military strength. The swarm entities began to behave strangely. Their perfect coordination faltered as they encountered humans who fought harder when surrounded, who became more dangerous when they had no chance of survival, and who made tactical decisions based on protecting strangers rather than logical, military objectives. Captain Beth Williams was discovering the same thing in deep space. Her Ghost Fleet ships had been monitoring swarm movements, waiting for the right moment to strike. When she saw the main Council fleet being destroyed, Beth activated the secret weapon that Earth had spent 5 years developing. All ships, begin. Emotional broadcast, she ordered her squadron. Full intensity, all frequencies. The hidden transmitters throughout human space came online simultaneously, broadcasting the collected emotions of every human in the galaxy, not just the trained soldiers but civilian families who were terrified for their loved ones, parents who would die to protect their children, and ordinary people who felt rage at the injustice of entire civilizations being destroyed. The effect on the Void Swarm was immediate and devastating. Their hive mind, designed to process logical tactical information, was overwhelmed by the chaotic flood of human emotions. Fear, love, sacrifice, anger, hope, and desperation crashed through their neural networks like a virus attacking a computer system. Swarm entities that had been moving in perfect formation suddenly broke ranks. Some began attacking their own forces, others froze in place as their programming tried to process concepts like dying for strangers or fighting without hope of victory. The massive fleet that had seemed unstoppable just hours before began to tear itself apart. Back on Earth, Admiral Parker watched the long-range sensors with amazement. The swarm forces are breaking formation throughout the galaxy. Whatever we are doing, it is working. Sir, Lieutenant Davis called out, we are receiving transmissions from the surviving Council forces. They are requesting permission to coordinate with our Ghost Fleet operations. Steve smiled grimly. A day ago, the Council had excluded humans from strategic planning because they were too emotional and illogical. Now those same aliens were begging for help from the species they had mocked. Grant them permission, Steve ordered, and send a message to all human forces. Operation Last Stand is now in full effect. Every human ship, every volunteer unit, every person who can fight, this is what we trained for. Throughout the galaxy, small groups of humans and their alien volunteers began emerging from hiding. They struck at swarm forces using tactics that no military academy would ever teach, ramming damaged ships into enemy formations, soldiers who refused to retreat even when completely surrounded, and rescue, missions that succeeded because the people running them refused to accept that some lives were not worth saving. The Void Swarm, designed to defeat any rational enemy, found themselves facing opponents who became stronger when losing, who fought harder when afraid, and who made tactical decisions based on emotion rather than logic. For the first time in 50,000 years of programmed existence, they were losing. High above Europa, General Kate Sullivan watched the tactical displays showing human forces throughout the galaxy. They were outnumbered 1,000,000 to 1, using weapons inferior to what the Council had deployed, and fighting an enemy that had just destroyed the largest fleet in history. But they were winning, because they were doing something the Swarm's creators had never imagined. They were fighting not to preserve their own forces, but to save everyone else, even the aliens, who had dismissed them as primitive and emotional. Now they understand, Kate said quietly, watching alien refugee ships being escorted to safety by human volunteers who would probably not survive the mission. Now they know what it means to fight like a human. 6 months after the last Void Swarm entity was destroyed, President Dan Cooper walked through the rebuilt Council chambers on Nexus Prime. The great circular hall looked smaller now, with only 200 species represented instead of the 847 that had gathered before the war. Empty seats served as silent reminders of civilizations that no longer existed, worlds that had been consumed before humanity's emotional weapons could save them. The surviving delegates watched Dan with expressions that ranged from gratitude to shame. Many of them had spent the past months trying to understand how the species they had dismissed as primitive had become their saviors. The mathematical models still did not make sense to them. By every logical calculation, Earth should have been destroyed along with the rest of them. "The memorial is ready for dedication," announced Admiral Jake Morrison, who now wore the uniform of Supreme Allied Commander, a rank created specifically for him by the grateful Council survivors. He carried a datapad containing the final casualty reports, numbers that told the story of humanity's sacrifice better than any speech could. Dan nodded and took his place at the center podium, the same spot where Dr. Lisa Grant had been mocked 6 months earlier for suggesting emotional warfare. Now Lisa sat in the front row as Earth's chief ambassador, her ideas having saved the galaxy from extinction. "We gather today not to celebrate victory, but to remember sacrifice," Dan began, his voice carrying to every corner of the chamber. 847 million beings died in the war against the Void Swarm. Of those, 847,000 were human. The mathematics were staggering and illogical. Humans had represented less than 1/10 of 1% of the galactic population, but they had taken nearly 100% of the military casualties. Any reasonable species would have preserved their forces, calculated acceptable losses, and retreated when the odds became impossible. Former High Counselor Vex approached the memorial wall, his insect-like body moving slowly. Age and guilt had bent his once proud frame, and his black eyes reflected the names carved into the crystalline surface. Human names mixed with alien ones, soldiers and civilians who had died saving people they had never met. "Ambassador Grant," Vex said quietly, his translator making his voice sound even more tired than usual. "I need to understand something that my species has been debating for months. Why did your people save us after we treated you so poorly?" Lisa looked up from the casualty reports she had been reviewing. The numbers showed the same pattern on every world. Human forces had taken the most dangerous assignments, protected alien evacuation routes, and died in disproportionate numbers saving beings who had called them primitive just months before. "Because that is what humans do," Lisa replied simply. "We do not fight for people who respect us, we fight for people who need us." Vex clicked his mandibles together in confusion. "But that makes no logical sense. Your species gained nothing from these sacrifices. In fact, you lost more than any other civilization in absolute terms. And we saved more than any other civilization. In absolute terms," Jake added, joining the conversation. "Over 2 billion refugees are alive today because human soldiers decided that some things are more important than survival." Commander Rick Hayes entered the chamber carrying the final report from the Ghost Fleet operations. His ships had spent the past 6 months hunting down the last scattered swarm entities, making sure that none survived to rebuild their forces. The work had been dangerous and exhausting, but Rick's crews had volunteered for every mission. "The galaxy is clear," Rick announced. "We found and destroyed the final swarm nest yesterday. The threat is over." A collective sigh of relief went through the chamber, but Dan noticed that the alien delegates still looked troubled. Victory had come at a price that their logical minds could not fully process. They had been saved by a species that fought harder, when losing, sacrificed more when victory was impossible, and made tactical decisions that violated every principle of rational warfare. Dr. Sarah Kim approached the group carrying her final analysis of the Void Swarm's remains. Her research had revealed the complete truth about humanity's enemy, and the implications were still difficult for many species to accept. The swarm's creators were remarkably similar to the current council, Sarah explained to the assembled delegates. They valued logic above emotion, calculated acceptable losses in every battle, and believed that rational thinking was the highest form of intelligence. They created the swarm to be the perfect weapon against enemies who thought like them. And it worked, Vex observed bitterly. The swarm destroyed their creators, and then lay dormant for 50,000 years, waiting for another logical civilization to arise. When we formed the Galactic Council, we became the perfect target. Amy Foster walked through the chamber with a group of young alien cadets who had volunteered to train at Earth's military academies. They wore mixed species uniforms and carried themselves with a confidence that their elders found both inspiring and disturbing. These youngsters had learned to fight like humans, making decisions based on protecting others rather than preserving themselves. "Commander Foster," called out Zala, the reptilian warrior who had served with Sergeant Tony Martinez during the evacuation of Kolar Prime. "How do you teach someone to be illogical? How do you train a rational mind to make emotional decisions?" Amy smiled, remembering her own training years before the war. "You do not teach them to be illogical. You teach them that some things are more important than logic. When you see a child in danger, you do not calculate the odds of survival before helping. You just help." The alien cadets nodded, though their expressions showed they were still struggling with concepts that humans understood instinctively: fighting without hope of victory, sacrificing yourself for strangers, choosing to do what was right instead of what was smart. These ideas went against millions of years of evolutionary programming in most species. President Cooper moved to the memorial wall and placed his hand on one of the names carved there: Sergeant Tony Martinez, who had died holding a bridge long enough for 3,000 alien civilians to escape. The tactical report said his position was indefensible, and his mission was mathematically impossible. Tony had succeeded anyway, because mathematics had nothing to do with his decision to stay and fight. The Council has voted to adopt new military doctrines based on human tactical principles, Dan announced to the chamber. Future officers will be trained not just in logical warfare, but in emotional decision-making. They will learn that sometimes the most irrational choice is the only right choice. Former High Counselor Vex approached the podium one final time. His species had ruled themselves through pure logic for thousands of years, making every decision based on careful calculation and rational analysis. The war had taught them that logic alone was not enough. "There is something else we must address," Vex said, his voice carrying through the chamber. "The humans saved us, but they also changed us. We can never go back to being the purely logical species we were before. We have learned that emotion is not weakness, it is strength we never knew we possessed." As the ceremony concluded, delegates began filing out of the chamber to return to their rebuilding worlds. But they carried with them a new understanding of what it meant to be strong. Not the strength of superior technology or logical thinking, but the strength to fight for others regardless of the cost. Ambassador Lisa Grant remained in the chamber after the others had left, standing before the memorial wall and reading the names of the humans who had died. Each name represented someone who had chosen to be human when being logical would have been safer. Above the memorial, workers had installed a new inscription that would greet every future council session. The words were simple, written in the EOD, basic galactic trade language that every species could understand, not because it was logical, but because it was right. The galaxy had learned what it meant to fight like a human. They would never mock Earth again.